Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Corby Connections with the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg. We are very excited today to have as our guest Professor Cindy Bergeman from the University of Notre Dame. Cindy is with the psychology department, where she directs, among other things, I'm sure, the adult development and aging lab, as well as the emotions and stress physiology lab. In that context, Professor Bergeman looks at questions of resilience as we get older, dealing with stress and how some people deal with it differently than others. Professor Bergeman, thank you so much for spending some time with the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg.
Gettysburg is one of my favorite clubs, so I'm very happy to do this.
You are remembered well from your visit. I understand you had a tour of the battlefield. There was a dinner involved. Yes. Well, you are fondly remembered by the folks in Gettysburg. So what I wanted to talk about with you is you wrote an article in the Notre Dame magazine not long ago, and you touched on sort of at a high level the work that you do at Notre Dame. And I find it fascinating, and I think a lot of our members, our club members will as well. You deal with resilience and aging. And so, of course, it doesn't take too much imagination to think of setbacks or sources of stress that people have as they get older, whether it's that adjustment from retirement into retirement, wondering if you have enough money to live on, that troubling diagnosis from a doctor, or becoming a caregiver, maybe for your spouse. And I see this professionally a lot with a spouse who has dementia, some form of dementia, and what that does to the other spouse, a spouse of several decades who's no longer recognized by the love of their life. And then, of course, losing control, whether it's mobility, the ability to pay bills, things like this. So there are stressors that are unique to the later years of life that are unlike the stressors for the younger years. And as I understand it, you generally look at how people are equipped to get through these and some of the tools in their toolbox to get through these stressors.
Yes, and we look at stress in a lot of different ways. So, you can think about stress as simply you just feel overwhelmed by the situation, whatever that situation is. But we can also have stress that are in very specific areas of our lives. So we might have stress in our work life or in our interpersonal relationships, but maybe we don't have stress in other areas of our lives. We have good financial resources available to us. We don't necessarily have to worry about finances, but we do worry about, something that has to do with the spouse, changes in their health, etc. So we can think about stress as a global entity. We can think about stress in particular areas of our lives, and we could think about it as major life events. That's one way that people look at stressors. Did you lose a spouse? Did you lose your job? Did you start a new job? All of those kinds of things can be stressful. But we can also look at stress in a caregiving role. So some people are caregivers, some people aren't. Some people see caregiving in a very negative, drudgery sort of way. And you could imagine that if the person you love no longer knows who you are, they might be physically, violent, they might be afraid themselves, but they don't really understand that. And so there's a lot of negative aspects of caregiving. But there are also positive aspects of caregiving. I think relationships become much closer during caregiving, especially if you have a spouse who's dying. It really is an opportunity to, kind of create some resolution, I guess, to the relationship. So some people look at caregiving in a positive way. Some people look at it in a negative way. Realists are probably more balanced across those two perspectives. But our stress could be in our finances. It could be that our neighborhood has changed around us and we no longer feel safe. It could be our health is changing. It could be we're losing social contacts, or we are no longer able to function in our environment. So the family's wanting to make sure that we're safe and putting us in, assisted living or having us move in with them. So we look at stress across a whole host of areas, and we look at it across what I call different time scales. So these more major global life events, but also what's happening day to day. You know, what is it that you're finding to be irritating or overwhelming that is occurring at a much more micro level? And in addition to our perceptions of stress, we also look at stress physiology. So we have an evolutionary mechanism, this fight or flee response that allows us to get the physiological energy that we need to escape from a threatening experience. And even though, you know, we're not a zebra on the savannah anymore, you know, we still have that same response. And what we see is that that physiological response that's adaptive in the moment is maladaptive over time. If we have events that just won't go away, or we have repeated stress hits, then we can begin to see some of the physiological changes. Increases in blood pressure, increases in cardiovascular disease, higher blood glucose levels, changes in immune function. And so there are these health outcomes that are associated with stressors that we don't deal with very well. So we look, how do you see your stressors, but also what does that physiology look like?
So I thought of a couple things while you were saying that. One is, it's sort of like that performance curve that people describe in the context of sports or any other sort of performance, even on the job, where a little bit of stress is good to get you motivated. Too much stress and it's self-defeating. So there's that aspect where I think that's where you're describing the little things that happen every day rather than the major life events that most people think of. But the other thing is, it's sort of it brings to mind this serenity prayer where you're thinking about what's in my control, what's not in my control, and do I know the difference? And right. I would think that what becomes physiologically harmful is when one is bothered by the things that they can't do anything about, that sort of helplessness that they start to develop. Or is that something that is a theme running through your research?
You know, absolutely. At the end of the day, stress is in the eye of the beholder. So you have some sort of experience, and you yourself decides whether that's a stressor. And some of that is you have this instantaneous physiological response, but then when you get more information, you realize that it's not a stressor. So a great example of this is you're walking down the street at night, you're by yourself, you feel like it's a little bit creepy, and you hear footsteps behind you, and the hair goes up on the back of your neck, your heart starts beating faster, and then you turn around and it's a friend who's running to try to catch up with you so that you have someone to walk with. So once you get that additional piece of information, then you reappraise the situation. So a lot of dealing with stress is looking at ways that you can appraise it. Is it something you can do anything about? If you can't, then one of the worst things you can do is try to control an uncontrollable stressor. That's, just a recipe for disaster, really. You have to look at ways to let that go. On the other hand, you just can't ignore things that are important that you can do something about and pretend that they don't exist. So the way in which we interpret our stresses is really key, I think, to managing our stressors. So that kind of first line of interpretation is really important. And I think some people see certain stressors as being very stressful and other people don't. Public speaking is a good example. Some people are happy to stand up in front of a group and, provide a lecture or information. Other people, that is a terrifying experience. And so how you interpret, I think, is really important. And it's important to sort of controlling the negative effects of stress.
Well, speaking of stressors that it might be hard to figure out a way to reframe it or reappraise it in a way that what you have control over and what you don't. The pandemic has just been a smorgasbord of circumstances we can't control. I've seen the stresses of families who can't attend a funeral or can't attend visit a loved one in a nursing home because of the lockdowns and so forth. The isolation has really gotten to a lot of people and had demonstrable negative health effects for them. So I understand that the pandemic, I mean, must have been a hindrance to your research in some ways, but it must have been a golden opportunity as well to study how people respond to circumstances beyond their control and what it does to their health. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The pandemic, you're right, was both an opportunity for me, but also a hindrance. I mean, we study older adults, they're vulnerable. We couldn't bring them into the research labs. We pretty much had to shut our in-person data collection down for more than a year. So we're interested in stressors. This is a unique opportunity because people are experiencing the same stressor. So when we tend to look at stress, some people are experiencing stress in one domain of their life, but not in another. And it was a great opportunity to see how this overlay of the pandemic as, I'm gonna say, an international stressor affected people sort of individually. And we started out collecting data in April. This was right after the stay-at-home orders in our area. And so we got a very early snapshot of how people were adjusting. We didn't really know what was going on. We didn't really understand the stressor. And then we followed them again by assessing them again in kind of September, October, again in January, February. We're getting ready to assess people again, probably in early March. How have people's ideas changed? How have their ability to deal with the stressor? How has that changed over time? And it was really quite interesting, and we haven't had a chance to take advantage of all of the information that we have. But older adults actually did better during the pandemic than younger adults. And you can kind of imagine that because younger adults had so many different demands on their time, attention, etc. So everyone was worried about getting COVID. Everyone was worried about the fact that, their social interactions were really limited. But beyond that, older adults, I think, had either better coping strategies. They were less influenced by, losing a job or continuing to be in a work environment where they didn't feel safe. Younger parents had kids that they were now trying to educate and keep track of while they might themselves still be trying to do their job. And they had other people that they were concerned about and et cetera. And we found that, interestingly, as we looked over time, the younger adults got better. The younger adults started looking more like our older adults in terms of just their ability to deal in a more positive way with what was happening from a COVID perspective. So the older adults have very good tools. The younger adults figured out how to develop those tools over time.
So you're saying that the older adults, maybe one of the biggest stressors was figuring out how to use Zoom or how to FaceTime.
It was.
That was a challenge, I will tell you that. but that
how do
communication.
I have dinner with my family over, in an online way, or how do I attend church services, online? So I think it was more for them, the difficulties that had to do with technology.
Sure, but certainly that's at least one dimension that's more manageable than worrying about the kids coming home from school with COVID and sharing it with the family, worrying about going to work, if you can even still work during COVID. So yes, there's been, I can imagine how the younger people just have multiple dimensions of stress. But I'd love to see I'm not sure it's been done yet, but research in the long haul about the effects of isolation, simply because, we witness so many people going into a higher level of care, whether it's assisted living or a skilled nursing care facility. And just they weren't even allowed to see their families, but they weren't allowed to see each other. They were just sort of confined to their rooms, and we witnessed precipitous declines in health. And so there was something going on there as well. And maybe that's not related to stress. Maybe that's something else. I don't know what the language of psychology would be there, but it's all intertwined. So having discussed that there are these stressors in life, these setbacks that either globally or the day-to-day annoyances that add up, what are some things that people can do to sort of build up their toolbox as they get older to give themselves a better chance at being resilient in the later years of life?
Probably one of the most effective ones is, the psychology lingo is reappraisal or reframing. How can we look at our stressors as opportunities to learn and grow versus looking at them as threats? And so, a good example is perhaps caregiving. Yes, it's very burdensome, it's emotional, but it's also an opportunity to spend really important quality time with that individual. I think it's a little harder when dementia is the cause of the need for caregiving, because that's not the person that you knew them to be. But in some sense, many of them still know. They know if you care about them, love them, are, treating them in a compassionate way. They still have that kind of sense, even though they may or may not know sort of who you are. So looking for the good in the bad, I think, looking at, sort of feelings of positive emotions in these difficult times. What can we learn from this? How might we grow from the experience? So these positive emotions, reframing is a really important component. We also know that control is important in, dealing with stressors, and some stressors are not controllable, but, finding support, finding someone who can help you to solve a problem, finding someone who's willing to listen to you and talk about the problem, taking some control over the situation is also a really important component.
I think that what you've described is often to the surprise of many older adults, what they find when they move into the dreaded assisted living or skilled nursing facility, at least from what I've heard anecdotally, is people are, they think, well, I don't want to leave my home. That's where my memories are. That's my whole identity is sort of wrapped up in my home. Plus there's the loss of control. But once they're there, the socialization, the activities that stimulate the mind, I mean, it takes them by some surprise, and that they enjoy it and they start striking up new friendships. So I think that's an example of finding the good in the bad, and finding ways to see this as an opportunity. There's probably bonding there that few other people can understand.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's a great example of, how we try, I guess, to make lemonade out of our lemons. But, really looking for the positives, the benefits in the situation is going to be much better from an outcome perspective.
And this is probably a question that you could answer for a very long time, but is there a short answer to the role of having a purpose? And maybe you've touched on that already a little bit, but the predictors of longevity and successful aging for people who have devoted themselves to, whether it's caregiving or I want to be a role model for my grandchildren, or whatever the purpose might be. And the purpose, I suppose, could change over time. But is there anything there that people could take away as finding your purpose in each stage of your life?
Absolutely. That is one of the best predictors of people who live to be 100, for example, is if you have a reason to get up every day, whatever that reason might be, it's very important to sort of the general health and well-being process, to longevity, et cetera. So absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for all of this. I could have this conversation for a long time, which is probably why I was a student in your department. And I'm just so grateful that you joined us with the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg, and we appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.